I'm going to talk about inter and intracultural variation as it is manifested through translation, and my claim will be that translation is highly eloquent in tracing aspects of variation in socio-cognitive aspects of experience, which are highly of interest to professional communication analysts and language educators, and of course, let alone translation practitioners. We're interested in achieving intercultural understanding. We need to develop some certain intercultural competencies. We need to develop some self-awareness about our own identities, and we also need to challenge our own assumptions, to be able to challenge our own assumptions. I guess all these type of data will be relevant to communication at work, language teaching, and translation practice. I'm going to work with parallel data, and I'm going to bring up issues which are tackled through monolingual data and comparable data. Parallel data is when you have the source text and the translated version. Monolingual data, you know what it is. Comparable data is when you have original production in two or more languages. I'm going to take a culture comparative approach, I must admit, not a culture interactional one, although I would suggest that translation can be seen in terms of, in culture interactional terms, in the sense that it is a professional practice, a professional routine, where the mediator's task is to perceive loci of difference and interfere to normalize discrepancies in agreement with ideological stances and institutional conventions. In doing so, I'm going to take a small notion culture approach, not the large notion of culture, according to Holiday, who assigns small culture to small social groupings, what we call communities of practice. Mainly, I'm going to talk about intercultural variation, but translation data can provide instances of very interesting cases of intracultural variation through, for instance, retranslation of playtexts. You can identify various narrative orientations. In advertising, the product category may make a difference in translating advertising. Or publication sites might be assuming a different agenda. I'm going to talk about genre, workplace culture, politeness and rapport management, identities at work, gender and age, leadership. These are issues brought up by professional communication analysts, and I'll try to see what type of data I have with reference to these topics. Genre as an analytical tool. Usually people compare and contrast genres and identities. I'm going to work horizontally on the one hand, but also vertically in the sense that I'll be comparing and contrasting language versions within particular genres. Professional communication analysts are concerned with how the staff may behave at workplace, whether they abide by the rules, how decisions are made, the dress code, swearing or taboo items. I'm going to stick to the last one, swearing and taboo items, and how offensive language may be treated in translation. We've got three genres: newspaper, literature, and performance. The newspaper article was called "A Boy Without a Penis," the English version, and the performance material was Ray Cooney's comedy "Out of Order," as this was staged in Greece. And we found out that offensiveness was toned down in the newspaper genre, but heightened in the comedy genre. I'm going to show you a few of the examples. Press data. A boy without a penis, 2 sex changes in a lifetime. Emphasis in Greek is placed on the human suffering aspect of the experience. The offensive item disappears in Greek. The same goes with the second example. And in the third, you have that reconstruction of a penis, which it's a nominalization. Nominalizations raise the level of formality, and therefore offensiveness is toned down again. This is an example from the performance data. You see that the English version, the Greek version, is the one which highlights the sexual connotation. This was a translation done by well-known theatre practitioners in Greece, Vasilis Zivilikas, by the way. We also attended the performance. Kostas Voutsas was starring, and we found out that during the performance, the actors were adding offensive items beyond what they had in the script. So this is what we had, offensiveness heightened in performance translation, toned down in Greek in the press. Workplace culture, our next theme. People have identified various conceptualizations about workplace environments. Some people liked to conceptualize workplace environments like a machine or an organism. I have evidence comparable data, evidence from a colleague of mine, Sofia Marmaridou, who examined, in 1994 it was, she examined financial data, and she found out comparable. And she found out that it was less tolerated in Greek to consider financial entities, the state, etc., as a living organism. The most common conceptualization in Greek was that these entities were conceptualized as constructions. We do have evidence of that through translation. Here are a few examples. You might have, for instance, in the heart of politics, translated as in the epicenter of politics. The living the living organism conceptualization is toned down. The fathers of the EU institution, let's say, the founders of the institution. Professional communication analysts are concerned with how people talk to a superior in the organizational structure of an institution, and I'm going to talk about power differentials through parallel data, power differentials between speaker and addressee mediated interaction. This is I think, a parallel situation. I got two pairs of texts. The first one was written in English by an Irish journalist, and it was on mass expulsion between Greece and Turkey. According to the Lausanne Treaty in 1923. The second one is an academic political text, so we have a subgeneric variation here. It's political discourse, but subgeneric variation. See a summary of the differences. In the first case, the power between author and reader is lower, and the power is negotiable, because people can remember the event, they still have very strong associations with the event. In the second case, the power distance is higher, and the power of the authority is less negotiable. The translator politeness in performing the speech act of representation is positive in the first case, in the sense that you have a much wider set of strategies. Manipulation of narratives, etc., which you do not have in the second case, where the politeness orientation is negative in the speech act of representation. And of course, in the first case, the theme is fueling uncertainty. In the second case, it doesn't. Workplace culture analysis. Masculine workplace is a very common theme in professional communication. Gendered corporations among British companies is very interesting. I don't have evidence of corporate workplaces, but with reference to gender. But I do have evidence of advertising. One is the translation of another. One highlights male gaze, the other highlights female gaze. And I'm going to ask you which is which. And of course, this is a rhetorical question. Okay. Politeness and report management. I'm going to talk about politeness orientation first, and then I'm going to try to say in what way translation can contribute to a report management theory. I have this extract by Julian House. In the functional pragmatic approach, the speech situation is defined as an action in which linguistic forms such as personal pronouns, sentence types, and modality assume new contextually determined values. I'm going to stick to that last phenomenon, modality. And I'm going to show you what we did with postgraduate students of ours. We got press data and tried to examine in what way modality has been treated across versions and see what we found. There are quite a few types of differences, but I'm going to highlight these two. There was higher certainty in Greek. This is a positive politeness device, expected behavior. And the other, you see that maybe becomes, the model marker is eliminated, and this heightened certainty, let alone the various adverbs which are added, like definitely, surely, etc., etc. And another tendency, another shift, epistemic may, for some reason, became must, and that was a tendency, not random instances. Both types of variation, the higher certainty and the shift from epistemic to deontic, make the speaker sound more authoritative, and this affects face work, as you might imagine. Headline newspaper headlines. We were examining how the various narratives on liberty and rights, justice, progress, and democracy have been treated in translation through press data. I'm going to present the liberty, an example which has to do with the liberty narrative. And I am doing it now here because it has to do with politeness. Constable identified two conceptions of liberty in political theory. The one is the ancient liberty, which has to do with collective political life, and the modern conception of liberty as peaceful independence. The next example I'm going to draw your attention to is this. See how this this mutual respect turns into negotiations. This is not translation, in fact. This is rather transediting type of thing. What you have here is that the negative liberty, on the one hand, you have the negative liberty of non-interference through the mutual respect item, versus the positive liberty of self-mastery in the second case. For some reason, the translator thought that the first version was not appropriate for Greek. The next thing I'm going to show you, so we see here that Greeks seem to be concerned about the translation orientation. What I'm going to do now is to show in what way translation could contribute perhaps to report management. Why am I doing this? Because we have evidence from Spencer Oti that we need to interpret to the concept of interaction more broadly. So I would assume that translation might be a good candidate for this. I got a play by Arthur Miller, Death of a Salesman. I identified various extracts at the beginning, which had intimacy and offensiveness. And I asked students to say which one they liked. The fact is that the awareness of the relational dynamic, that was the finding. Awareness of the relational dynamics in the play seems to override the importance of polarity orientation concerns. That was the outcome. And let's see now how it was done. You see the various extracts A, B, C, the source text, and the three versions. I gave the three versions to students and I asked them to say which one they liked without explaining anything else. At the beginning, they seemed to like the versions which had occasional positive politeness devices, some evaluation, some exaggeration, some directness. They seemed to like those extracts. But little by little, as they became aware of the relational dynamics in the play, they seemed to appreciate the relational tension between intimacy and offensiveness. And I think, so little by little, the version which highlighted, had the heightened intimacy and heightened offensiveness was the third one. So you see, as they became aware of the relational dynamics, they seemed to appreciate not what was positively polite, but the relational dynamics, the tension between offensiveness and I'm going to take the domains of politeness, for three of them, I'm sure I can provide material through evidence through translation material. The locutionary domain, the mediator-addressee distance may be threatening in some relational contexts across cultures or within cultures, and I have to report this, which I think is a translation case in the sense that one may be translating, the native speaker may be translating into his mind or her mind the native experience. If I give a lecture in Greek and I keep on using hedges, the case seems to be that, or the findings seem to show that, all this. People will either think that I'm not prepared enough for the talk, or our students might think, well, she's a professor. Can she tell what she sees in her data? Because why? Because higher certainty is a value, seems to be a value in Greek. So I would assume this to be an instance of translation in the sense that we implicitly translate in our minds our structures of our native language. Topic choice and topic management, the discourse domain. This can be manifested through how publishing houses select topics of books to be translated. And we have evidence from Asimakoulas, 2005. He examined how Bertolt Brecht was translated into Greek during the military junta, 1967-74, and he found that there were a couple of publishing houses which promoted through their agendas, particular topics, and they soon became an arena for resistance. I'll skip this. This is a stylistic domain. When you translate a work in two different languages, the work may acquire completely different features, stylistic features, which is a manifestation, identities at work, which is a manifestation of them. See how this is from a PhD dissertation of the University of Athens. How some roles may be enacted. This is visual material from the Greek National Tourism Organization. See the lady at the beach. She looks like a mermaid, which matches with "Live Your Myth in Greece" caption. See the sophistication here, which is assumed to be a value. Interlocutors do power work. See the lady who is escorted. the weak gender position of the lady who is escorted and introduced to knowledge. Through verbal material now, see how a company constructs the identity of the client. Siemens Power Engineering says resources for tomorrow versus Siemens close to human needs. The one approach is transactional, the second is interpersonal. I hope you agree that the version which fuels uncertainty is the Greek one. Who's going to warn them with those human subjects? Who's going to warn them after 40 years? There are quite a few other differences which I'm going to skip because they don't seem to be quite relevant here. Company identity, Estée Lauder Cosmetics, our research shows versus our research section has proven that. Research section connotes we're a whole department here. It's not just random research. That has proven versus shows testifies to the higher certainty on the Greek side. Publishers. This is best-selling Victoria Hislop. This is the back cover of the book. See how the publisher accounts for the plot. Alexis Fielding discovers secrets of the past. This became a TV series. Look at the Greek version. You do have that trip to the past, but we have a kind of binary thinking. Information is presented contrastively, as if it can be processed more easily. Strong versus sensitive, beautiful versus ambitious. It seems random, but it's not, in the sense that this is a tendency almost everywhere. Even students, when they write their translations, they tend to add contrasted connectives. It is as if you present that binary thinking seems to connote objectivity or I don't know what. This seems to be a preference. So we see that energy companies, cosmetics companies, and the publishing industry seem to perceive the identity of clients differently, and this is constructed through translation discourse. The Buckles and Hall identity construction framework. These are the various principles. I'm going to take one by one and see what I can provide in terms of translation data. By the way, this is our Tegma archive. It's the metaphrasis site of the University of Athens, where we actually, I have uploaded all our language pairs, English and Greek, from the press for other people to use. The emergence principle. These are press headlines, and I'd like to show you in what way the Greek version highlights the human weakness and vulnerability narrative through the medical device which is being used, the pacemaker, which is a device for heart disease. Insomnia is combated, and this is as if it were a disease. Anemic man coming up in the source in the target version, and the vulnerable genes. That's the emergence principle. Identities emerge through discoursal options. The positionality principle. This is from No Man's Land, Pinter's No Man's Land. I'm going to show gender and age identity through this type of data. We have Spooner, who attempts to ingratiate himself and convince the host, he's a visitor, and convince the host to keep him in the house. He finally fails, but I Speak to You is translated into Greek. Pavlos Matesis is the translator. I open myself up to you, and the homosexual connotation becomes more evident. Which appeals has been rendered as which irritates me. Kindness itself is the relevant item, not clearly in fact. it becomes in flesh and blood. All these clearly is translated as fosfanari, which connotes brings connotations of the red light district, probably, or it's my dirty mind. I hope it's not. Anyway, so we see those homosexual connotations coming up in the Greek version by a very influential, very good translator. Let me perhaps be your boatman. Death connotations here. Let me perhaps be your boatman. That's a homosexual sexual connotation. To manage the boat which will take you. This addition. It is as if he's telling you, you're old, you're going to die, the boat will take you. Because if we talk about a river, it's about Acheron, and Acheron is the river of Hades. So see how the death connotations are becoming obvious. In the indexicality principle, same play, spooner is made in Greek to use French loan expressions, although there are readily available options in Greek for, by the way, poetry readings and remarkable success. Instead, you have apropos, poetry soirées in Greek, and grand succès. Why? This is a manifestation of the positionality principle, because the spooner wants to show his elevated social background. He wants to show off in a way, and convince the host to keep him with him. The Hothouse, Pinter again, is a black comedy set in a government rest home, an odd establishment either for a mental home led by an army officer Root. It's fairly obvious that Efficient Gibbs, a subordinate, intends to replace Root as head of the establishment. Identity and difference in the relationality principle. See how submissive Gibbs is through those hedges, and how what a hegemonic profile Root has. Discrepancy. I'm damn sure there is a discrepancy. You come and tell me that a man has died, and I've got it down here that I had a conversation with him yesterday morning. And there are quite a few of. See now the genuine artifice the implementation of the genuine artifice artificial identity relation. See how abrupt and direct Gibbs can be when he addresses a love partner. Stop it, I'm not in the mood. So what we see here is that little by little, the audience realizes that Gibbs' identity is artificially crafted, and this is how violence in the subtext is becoming obvious in Pinter, through the translation as well. Back to press articles now, and that's the authority, the legitimacy identity relation. See how the racism issue comes up in the Greek version. This is institutionalized notions of power, which affirm racist identities, as they are alluding to the injustice between groups narrative. The next example is delegitimizes the authority of the boss. It's good for the heart reason-giving item. Delegitimizes the authority of the boss. The last example, principle, the passionless principle, namely that identities may be habitual and not fully conscious, is manifested in this second example. They will seat passengers back to front for earning more seats. This is an addition. This implements and highlights the economic rationality narrative. We do everything for money. And this is ideologically motivated. But the fact that this is done through the reason-giving device may go unnoticed unless you sort of juxtapose types of data. I have in mind the discourse and society issue, and I'd like to say that translation has something to contribute to this. Namely, I have in mind the work by Kanikli Vuthemis and Julian House. Translation rewrites the frame of austerity, giving rise to new frames of understanding. You have the contamination metaphor and the game-framed event, while Greece is relayed as either a victim or a key stakeholder of the Eurozone. Gender and age. We all know that there are stereotypical ideas which as to how men and women behave, which may not be true. With Power from Kefisha, which was staged in Athens, which was staged in London, as With Power from Shoreditch, the place name was changed. I gave students the two opening pages of the play, and there were two people conversing, the mother and the teenage daughter. And I asked them to say, in the translation, who was male and female. I raised names. The mother was identified by 100% as female, the daughter was identified by 60% as male. So you see, the translation can actually show gender identities and age identities. I must admit that the type of translation data I've got cannot ensure a participatory approach where research is carried out not on or for, but with the participants. I haven't done this so far. Just an example of how gender is being reshaped through translation. This is Pavlos Matis's translation of A Streetcar Named Desire. See how Matis weakens the gender position of Stella at the beginning of the play. She cries out in protest. She lets out a little cry of protest. That little cry diminishes her position, weakens her gender position. Can I come and watch? Stella asks her husband, who goes to bowling. By the way, in Greek it was translated, in the Matis's translation, it was translated as football to retain the connotation of the popular athletic game. I hope you agree that that if you translate this, can I come and look? It highlights some kind of purposelessness on the part of Stella, and it shows her non-involvement in male athletic games. So her position is actually... This is postgraduate students working on the very fun of gendered identities, social identities in Mrs. Warren's profession, but Madame Bovary, leadership enactment. Even the forms and underlying concepts people use to talk about leadership may vary remarkably across workplaces and professions. Thank you. I don't have evidence of corporate leadership, but I do have evidence of political leadership and how this is manifested through press data. Well, see how this, from a PhD dissertation, see how Mr. Obama's profile is portrayed in the Greek press. This is Caroline Kennedy talking about the new president. She says, I want a president who understands that his responsibility is to articulate a vision and encourage others to achieve it. Whereas in the Greek version, it's the president who's going to do everything. The electoral body is assumed to be passive. His vague philosophy is turned into bold philosophy. He shows boldness and sensitivity, which is added, in fact, in the. You see that he seems to be an all-rounded character, and you see that binary thinking again, bold and sensitive. He orders people, doesn't tell people in Greek. He comes along like a messiah, and he's the Almighty. Although the Almighty feature here is negated, I think that the very mention of the adjective suffices to bring up the narrative of the Almighty. Mr. Tony Blair, ex-Prime Minister, two pairs of texts. These are the source texts, which were translated in Greek. We identified three types of shifts. I'm not going to deal with the first one. This is predictable behavior, although it's very, very useful for language teachers. Very extremely useful for language teachers. The second, I called creative and voluntary behavior, and it has to do with metaphors. And the third one is very interesting, changeable behavior, what is left out and why. I'm going to skip this. This is the stuff which is very interesting for language teachers. Mr. Blair is at the bridle of Britain. Britain is the horse. This is in the Greek text, right? Britain is the horse, and see how the connotation of the passive, the low civic engagement narrative comes up in Greek again. I'll skip the next one. So we have variation in terms of how leadership is conceptualized across English and Greek. And this is the beginning of the article. It's about a trip which was cancelled because Mr. Tony Blair's advisors had second ideas about it. And this was completely omitted. And the question is why? Well, the reason seems to be that the power of the leader was mitigated, and that's why it was omitted. Because I'll skip this. Because we have evidence from Haywood that there are some features of presidentialism, I'm going to highlight the first one: the tendency of prime minister to distance themselves from their parties and governments by presenting themselves as outsiders or developing their own ideological stance. Well, that extract was omitted because it contradicted the special leadership feature of presidentialism. He had to appear powerful enough, and he wasn't, if that material would have been... this is my last comment. We have evidence from Anguri that real-life data from multinational corporate environments can complement business English textbook materials. This goes for a translation as well, and it's now language teaching has welcomed translation into the field, and they seem to be able to see its usefulness. So I guess if one could come up with translated material in intra-team communication at the workplace, that would be extremely telling about what is going on through translation as well. What I've actually talked about is translation in other language contexts. It's called talk. Not for translation studies per se, but for other disciplines where translation can actually contribute quite a lot. And there's a new journal coming up which has that talk perspective. That's all I had to say. I'd like to thank you, and if there are a few questions, I'd love to listen to them.